Now, as many of you will be aware, the upheaval that the pandemic has triggered is causing people to do a lot of thinking locally and globally about where we go from here and how we build back better. At Interfaith Glasgow, we believe this critical juncture presents a fantastic opportunity for interfaith dialogue. This break from normality that the pandemic has thrust upon us is a unique opportunity to review that normality and to think deeply about what we valued in it and what we would like to change. It's vital that people from across faith and belief communities have a chance to contribute to this thinking and have a say in the conversations currently taking place. Not only does it matter to hear from people of all faith and belief traditions, and especially those whose voices may have been marginalized, it matters that we reach out across community boundaries so as to discuss the challenges we face together. We need to really listen to each other so that our thinking can be influenced by others where it needs to be, and our own experiences and ideas can have their influence as we grapple our way together towards shared solutions to shared challenges. As noted at the start of the last event, the series title, Voices from the Portal, was inspired by the words of Indian writer Arundhati Roy. Those words bear repeating. She writes, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." Thank you then for joining us this evening for another opportunity to imagine our world anew. Though from different religious and cultural backgrounds, I'm confident that there is enough that we share, that it's not unreasonable to hope that we might find a common vision to fight for. Turning then to this evening's focus, racism and religion. This week is National Hate Crime Awareness Week, and it's also Black History Month. Not a bad time then to hone in on the issue of racism, which has permeated news, culture and thought throughout 2020. The new wave of Black Lives Matter protests sparked this year by the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor and others has been unprecedented in scale, with an estimated 15 to 26 million people in the United States participating in demonstrations, making this the largest social movement in American history. And it is a social movement that has spilled out well beyond the US, drawing attention to the racism that still manifests itself in multiple ways around the globe, and which in some contexts appears to be getting worse. The pandemic, moreover, has highlighted the deep inequalities that exist in society, not least in the fact that here in the UK, Black and ethnic minority communities have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and in the fact that the Western media's coverage of the pandemic has been deeply biased, tending to ignore or downplay the significant public health achievements of any nations not white and rich. Sometimes racism can be as much about what we're not seeing as what we are seeing. Focusing tonight on the intersection of religion and racism, we will seek to better understand respects in which we and our communities may have been complicit in racism. And we will also consider wherein lies our capacity to tackle racism. Although there seem to be many places and ways in which the voices of bigotry and prejudice are getting louder, the voices of resistance are also rising. And with this resistance, there seems to be a growing acknowledgement on the part of many that we need to educate ourselves, that we need to work to attune our attention to forms of racism we might previously have been ignorant to, and that we need to listen to those directly affected by racism in order to better understand how we can be effective allies in the fight for equality. This evening, we'll consider how religions might have contributed to the problem and how people of faith might contribute to solutions. What does anti-racism look like for people of faith? So it's my great pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers tonight, Calvin Taylor, who's a program manager at Interfaith Youth Corps. Calvin is a native of Chicago and is a social entrepreneur, manager and creative partner. As a program manager at Interfaith Youth Corps, he manages a portfolio of projects across the organization's three primary areas: campus change, innovation and narrative, and works with faculties as they incorporate innovative interfaith themes into their pedagogy and curricula. Calvin is a graduate of Trinity International University and Emory University's Candler School of Theology. Outside of Interfaith Youth Corps, you can catch Calvin working closely with community and religious organizations in Chicago and Atlanta, enjoying tennis and basketball, and looking to further his impact at the intersection of education and social entrepreneurship. Thank you so much for being with us this evening, Calvin, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Over to you.
I'm honored to be with you all today. Thank you so much to Rose, to Katie, and the entire team for the invitation to be with you all. Since I was a child, I have always been fascinated by time. So the fact that it is daylight at noon here in Chicago and it is evening time where most of you are just excites the kid that is still in me. So once again, thank you for the invitation, and happy to share some thoughts with you all as well. I'm going to set my timer now so I can ensure that I am a good steward of all of our time together. The question of how religions and faith contribute to racism is a large question, one that shaped my graduate studies and one that many scholars continue to seek answers for. And if you see me looking off screen, I'm just looking at some notes on my other monitor. It is difficult to address that question because there are many answers, and there are also many answers to its sibling question, how religions and faith can dismantle racism. Because the question is such a large question with many answers, I have decided to focus on a specific example that I believe best highlights how religion contributed to racism in America in the 20th century, and the legacies of it that are present and active today. My following remarks and comments only scratch the surface of the phenomenon we know as the KKK. Now, to some, this may seem like an extreme example, right? The KKK is, probably the biggest hate group in America. And is it really indicative of what we typically find in America? But in reality, it is not an extreme example at all. I think it's simply a very salient and potent example of the way in which religion can and has been used to oppress human beings. And so as theologians, I'm sure which many of you may be on this call, we instinctively recognize the ways in which regimes, nations, and governing bodies have used theology and religion of all sorts to inform their supremacy. Theologies have formative power, not just in the spiritual and religious lives of its adherents and practitioners, but also the power to inform their political philosophies and theories of how the world and societies should be ordered, which in turn shapes and forms the way they act in the public square, including voting and creating policy. I'm not sure if you all have been keeping up with the Senate examination of the Supreme Court nominee here in America, but it is one of the clearest examples of how religious belief has the power to shape a whole nation and therefore even shape the world and how their nation acts in the world. But the question still needs to be asked. What about non-state, non-federal actors that wield power and influence in our lives? To see this in action, we can go straight to the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan. So it's important to know how something started to fully comprehend how it developed. So the Ku Klux Klan was founded in December 1865, a year that brought about the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction in America. The end of the Civil War marked the end of slavery as a legal institution, and many Southern whites were upset over the loss of their property. Furthermore, with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, newly freed Black men and women were taking full advantage of their newly granted rights and equality, albeit theoretical, right? This new equality with whites, and a lot of white people were not happy about it. The writer Susan Campbell Bartoletti, in her book, They Call Themselves the KKK, The Birth of an American Terrorist Group, and I'll put any, sources that I cite in the chat afterwards so you all can have them. She puts it this way: the notion of racial equality was a great insult to white Southern pride. During slavery, the racial rules had been clear. Now some Black people openly challenged the authority of whites. Some refused to call their former owners master, which is just one example. Reconstruction brought about fundamental changes in the legal hierarchy of Black and white people in the American South. And so the 6 founders of the KKK were all Confederate soldiers in the war. And in 1866 in Tennessee, the KKK was formed as a social group. And so the KKK became a terrorist group that was zealous to set back Reconstruction progress in the South. They wholeheartedly were dedicated to racial inequality in life as they knew it before the Civil War. However, this did not last long, and eventually the federal government dismantled the KKK. Yet the KKK experienced a revival in the early 20th century. And note how I am using religious language such as revival, because that is how many American historians write about the KKK because of its religious roots. The KKK experienced a rebirth of sorts in 1915. Michael Newton, in his book, White Robes and Burning Crosses, A History of the Ku Klux Klan from 1866, stated that, or estimated that at its peak in the 1920s, the KKK had about 5 million members across America. So remember, this is the early 20th century, and the American population is, of course, not as large as it is now. So 5 million members is quite a few. While the numbers increased exponentially in the early 20th century, the most important change in the Klan was its relationship to Christian Protestantism. Originally, the KKK became even more exclusive originally the KKK was mainly a racial hate group. But in its resurgence and as it expanded, the KKK became even more exclusive on the basis of religion. Only men who were native-born Americans who believed in the tenets of the Christian religion could join. And soon after, they allowed white women to join as well. The KKK was no longer just a group that was anti-Black or anything that is not white, but they became anti-Semitist, anti-Catholic, and biblically fundamentalist. According to Baker, the KKK believed not only that members were the defenders of Protestant Christianity, but also that God had a direct hand in its creation and formation. Essentially, the KKK saw itself as God's created order destined to protect America. And so the Ku Klux Klan saw the Bible as its foundation upon which it stood. This is not surprising considering that the Klan claimed to be a legitimate Protestant Christian group, right? It would be difficult to be Christian, or at least claim to be, and not anchor yourself with the Bible. Besides, when you reflect on the history of the Christian church, heresies and dissenters fashioned scriptural support. And so the Klan explicitly stated in their publications, quote, "We magnify the Bible as the basis of our Constitution, the foundation of our government, the source of our laws, the sheet anchor of our liberties, the most practical guide to living, and the source of all true wisdom. We honor the Christ as the Klansman's only criterion of character. Furthermore, many popular preachers in America at the time were known openly to be members of the KKK." And so, although the notion of biblical foundation might seem a bit juvenile and even naive in this instance, it is kind of possible to see and at least cognitively appreciate the complexities and nuances that existed in Klan theology. And so on the one hand, it was full of racial and religious discrimination, bigotry, and hatred. And on the other hand, the Klan genuinely saw their beliefs and practices as the work of God that was destined by God. So I'm going to skip down a little bit, but there are many citations of the KKK citing specific scriptural texts as support for their stance on racial inequality. And so the KKK believed in a radical form of white supremacy. and to propagate the American ideals as founded in the Constitution of the United States. And so most white Southerners believe that God created Black people for the special purpose of working and serving white people. More particularly, they saw themselves being at the top of the human racial hierarchy as something that was embedded in the creation of the world, right? And so they're using scriptural texts, they're using the Christian religion to propagate their racism, their discrimination, their anti-Catholicism, etc. And so to close out this part, I'll just quote the words of the Grand Dragon of South Carolina, who's sort of like the leader of the KKK in the South. He said, the KKK should prevent America from becoming the melting pot or the dumping ground of the world. And so the KKK shaped and formed the white supremacist regime as we know it. And in order to truly dismantle racism here in America and around the globe, we have to focus in on how white supremacy is the larger system that needs to be dismantled, one that has many interlocking systems of oppression: capitalism and the wealth and income gap, anti-Black racism and state violence, patriarchy, sexism and misogyny, homophobia and transphobia, and the one that is most closely related to our topic for today, Christian supremacy. And so when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, you will see that they have a keen understanding of intersectionality, which is a theoretical framework for understanding how different aspects of a person's social and political identities compound, overlap, or intersect to create different and unique modes of discrimination, oppression, and privilege. I have about 4 minutes left. Another thing that the Black Lives Matter movement gets right is its decentering of religion and religious spaces, especially the decentering of religion as sort of the primary place where the movement for Black lives and civil rights finds its foundation. Now, of course, right, this was a major phenomenon that we saw in the 60s and the 70s with the civil rights and the Black Power movements that were led by leaders like Malcolm X, Dr. Martin King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., etc. And yet one thing the founders of the Black Lives Matter movements, which are 3 queer Black women, one thing that they do is, which I think is a general reflection of the zeitgeist of folks born after 1980 in America, who are the main folks organizing for change right now. They find their liberatory practices in speech not centered on religion. And I think this is because of used as a tool to reinforce, uphold, and perpetuate the white supremacist order. Religion then can and should be a tool for liberation, right? Religious speech and action has liberatory power as we have seen it throughout history. So let me tell you a story as I come near to my close. When I was doing my graduate studies, I remember talking to a white professor who is also a theologian, who shared stories about his time doing PhD work in religion. One of the most powerful but sad things that he shared with me, which I've heard many others talk about, is how so many white theologians, professors, and preachers denounce Dr. James Cone, who is the founder of Black liberation theology and the author of so many seminal texts here in theological America. He shared that while he was completing his graduate studies, sometime in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, his advisor threatened his place in the program if he decided to engage James Cone's work, describing it as feeble theology at best and a sad excuse for scholarship at worst. And so then, with this history in tow, the KKK, Jim Crow, and the silencing of Black voices, how does religion, or how can religion be used to dismantle racism? One, the first thing is We should amplify the voices and work of scholars, writers, artists, and activists who have shown how religion has and can be used for liberation and freedom, especially Black, Indigenous, and other voices of color. I'm thinking particularly of many womanist theologians, such as Natalia Lee, Mercy Amba Oduyoye, Emily Towns, Katie Cannon, and others such as James Cone, Malcolm X, Dwight Hopkins, Eve Ewing, Kimberly Crenshaw, etc. These are just a few of the people who write and have been writing and working to dismantle racism and white supremacy and outlining the global struggle for freedom. When we elevate and amplify voices who have been silenced, we proclaim and give space to not just their thoughts and their scholarship, but to their lives and their very existence. 2, white people and other non-Black people of color must begin and continue to be accomplices. So I'm not a fan of the term ally because ally seems to be a little bit too passive, right? It allows too much space for folks to disappear when the road gets tough. It doesn't necessarily require courageous action. Accomplices, on the other hand, are there to the end. They scheme and plot against the system and use their privilege to protect when needed and their privilege to amplify when necessary. That is why I've been so encouraged by the courageous action of so many non-Black people, especially young white women who have been standing on the front lines during the Black Lives Matter protests, literally using their bodies to create a barrier between Black protesters and the police force. 3, giving special attention to the particularities of existence, right? When we privilege intersectionality as a tool to understand racism and other forms of oppression, it allows us to tease out and attend to the ways in which systems and structures, especially oppressive systems and structures, affect the material realities of the oppressed and those affected by white supremacy. And by the material realities, I mean the way structural racism affects the day-to-day existence of Black people and other folks who are affected by white supremacy, which essentially is all of us. Number 4, and finally, this work must be a priority in religious spaces. Because white supremacy affects every aspect of our society, anti-racism work must be done in all spaces. Religious actors must first attend to the ways in which their spaces and structures give way to racism and white supremacy. And so finally, what are some questions that religious actors can ask themselves in their congregations and communities? How is power distributed in our community? What does my theology or my philosophy or my beliefs say about the value of Black lives? Does my religious speech and action create space for others to be freely and for others to fight for their freedom? And so once we begin to ask these questions, more questions and answers will surface, allowing us to truly examine and investigate racism and then eventually dismantle racism and white supremacy, which starts at home, in our hearts, with our families, and in the most intimate and private parts of our inner life. This gives way and empowers us to act the same way publicly. It requires everyone, and it only works when we are all working toward the freedom of all people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Calvin. You've given us so much to think about there, and yeah, exactly the kinds of things that we were hoping to hear and that we need to hear. So thank you so much.
So it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker now, Mahrukh Adnan Shaukat, who's a development officer at Amina Muslim Women's Resource Centre here in Glasgow. As development officer at Amina, Mahrukh is currently working on improving levels of understanding in relation to equalities and inclusion practice across all sectors, particularly regarding gender, race, and religion. Her responsibilities include creating campaigns involving visual and literal representations of a diverse range of Muslim women's voices. Mahrukh is also a board member for Youth Community Support Agency, again based here in Glasgow, and chair of the Side by Side Interfaith Gender Justice Initiative. Thank you very much for being with us this evening, Mahrukh. I'm very much looking forward to your contribution. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Rose, and thank you for everyone else at Interfaith Scotland, Interfaith Glasgow for putting together this really interesting talk today, event for everyone to contribute to, and for inviting me along to be part of it. It is something that I've always found to be a topic which it's growing actually in interest for me just now, in terms of actually looking at the nitty-gritty of it. But in terms of activism, it's always been there. And as a Muslim woman, I suppose my whole being can be politicized in lots of different ways, and I'm not the only one. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak to a varied audience about not only my experiences, but how I'm starting to understand the world, and get your thoughts and reflections on that as well. So where do I start with this? So what I wanted to talk about today was actually a little bit on where we get our knowledge from. So the dissemination of knowledge. And I have to credit, and have been thoroughly influenced by this book here. I don't know if you can all see it, but it's called The Walking Quran. And it's by Dr. Rudolph T. Ware III, who's an African-American scholar and also an activist within his own community. And his work, The Walking Quran, was based in a research project he did in the region he calls Senegambia, or refers to as Senegambia, which is Senegal, Gambia, a bit of Mali, and a bit of Mauritania in Western Africa. And in the beginning of his book, in his introduction, he talks about the fact that race would have to be included at the start of his book, because it was talking about the inception of knowledge and where people's knowledge came from, West Africa, when it came to religion and what they were taught. And I found this incredibly interesting because it started to spark lots of thoughts in my own brain about where I seek knowledge and where I see knowledge coming from, and what is held as sacred knowledge within Islam. So if we travel back about 1442 years ago, Islam started in Saudi Arabia, in a city called Makkah. Yes, I can give the title of the book, by the way. I just saw that comment. In Makkah. And in Makkah, we have the prophet that we believe in as Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, receiving revelation straight from God. And this was given out to the people in spoken form. It wasn't written down until a long time later, where bits and pieces of what people had heard through oral tradition started to become written down. And the prophet himself, peace be upon him, was illiterate, as in he couldn't read and write himself, so it had to be passed down by oral tradition. Now, the knowledge and the status of knowledge that often occurs in Saudi Arabia and also in other Arab countries comes from how much you have memorized and how much you know from what you've memorized. So your repository of knowledge is in how much you know, and the status that goes with that depends on how much you can memorize and who you have learnt from. Knowledge in the UK and how we process and what we're encouraged to do is almost based a little bit more in the Enlightenment period. So we're talking more about critical thinking, we're talking about creative ways of accessing knowledge, we're talking about people going into different positions into society based on what they know how to do. So that could be people going into apprenticeships, that could be people going into university or colleges, that could be people having a vocation. So there are different ways in which you can represent. And in West Africa, as Dr. Ware talks about, knowledge about religion is corporeal, as in it's something that you embody. It's something that you physically work with. It's something you physically show. So that could be through your actions, through cooking, bringing a family together, walking, talking, and enacting things that you have learned. It's more of a physical representation. And I found this fascinating because I started to see where threads of racism could then tie in. Because if you believe that knowledge and how important knowledge is passed on is through oral tradition and how much you have memorized, then it's slightly easier to look down on people who cannot or have not memorized from the same sources that were close to the original source, i.e. from Arab countries, that have not memorized or learned in the same way, and that don't know as much because the stories may have not traveled as far. So if we think that in Islamic traditions, we pass down knowledge and a lot of it is in Arabic, for example, we pray ritually in Arabic. We do a lot of our extra prayers based on the prayers that we know came from the Prophet and his followers. Our azan, our call to prayer, is in Arabic. If we have embedded these traditions within our tradition, part of the knowledge, part of the status, of our knowledge encapsulates the Arab status of knowledge, how much you memorize. So we kind of take a little bit of that Arab Puritanism into what makes the best version of Islam. And you can see that sometimes in traditions of certain Muslim countries around the world. Whereas in West Africa, where they're teaching in Arabic, but also in other ways, where they're embodying knowledge in other ways, it can be that certain parts of the Muslim world can start to see that as syncretism. And syncretism means an amalgamation of different religions, cultures, and schools of thought. So essentially, it is muddied. So we have the Puritan version, which is pure memorization and the same words that have been passed down generation to generation. Then we have syncretism, which is a perceived muddying of different cultures. So this is where we can start to see that some cultures and some parts of a religion, or some people who respond to the same religion, can start to see others as understanding the religion less. Now, Dr. Ware says this impacts people in West Africa perhaps sometimes more because of the supremacy of colonialism and of the idea of enlightenment being spread across the world with the spread of racism. So even though other parts of the world may be seen as a completely different tradition and otherwise it wouldn't matter, white supremacy has embedded the fact that some countries that have access to a certain way of learning, i.e. universities, the kinds of things we're used to, have a supremacy over knowledge collection. So the Arabs have their own, Western countries may have their own, and then you get African nations who are seen as syncretistic. So the idea that their knowledge is diluted is strongest, also he argues. Now, amongst the Islamic tradition, it's in the religion itself, one of the reasons why anti-racism might not be a strong narrative is because we have traditions, we have sayings that strengthen Islam's role as an anti-oppressive religion, but also specifies its distance to racism. So one of those things might be a saying from the last sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which a lot of people might be familiar with, which says, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white person has no superiority over black, nor black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action. So people can hold on to this and say, like, there is no racism in Islam. Islam in itself cannot be racist. I would argue that doesn't mean that Muslims cannot be racist, and that the knowledge or how we pass down religion, who we look to for credible religious knowledge, and how we form our religious ideas can be racist through humans' own intervention. One of the ways, again, that Islam can take apart racism and religion and put them to the side is the idea of a fitrah. Fitra is an Arabic word which is describing like innate spiritual capacity. And it links to the idea that souls were all created at once and they all stood before God and they recognized him. Now, this is a belief which every Muslim should have. It's a popular and well-known one. And it also corresponds to the idea that if people embrace Islam who haven't always been Muslim, that some people might term them revert, as if they're returning to something. So this is where that idea comes from. Instead of converts, we have reverts, although obviously that person is entitled to name themselves however they like. So we have the idea of not separating Arabs from non-Arabs, black from white, And we also have the idea of a fitra. There is another way of knowing God, because we have always known God. So every person has an innate capacity to know God in and of themselves. And if they have that, then everybody has their own knowledge of God that doesn't come from man. So within religion, we have these two ideas which can help separate us. Well, within Islam, we have these two ideas which can help separate us from racism. But those things at the same time can also be blinders for people who are in racist structures, because of the idea of racism being linked with immorality and the idea of religion being linked with morality. So if you're a religious person and consider yourself a devout person, people tend to consider that as being a good person. Therefore, I can't be racist. But that's slightly different from the racist structures that we have today, which I described earlier, which is about, can come from, not exclusively, of course, but from the dissemination of knowledge, who we decide is credible and whose ideas are in the majority, whose ideas are mainstream, and where do we go for information. So those are the two different ways in which I can see that religion in one case can help with racism, and in the other case it can uphold structures by not actually looking at what it is we're learning and where we're getting our education from. The last thing that I want to mention is that there is, or has been, a racialization of religion in general. And some religions, and I don't want to speak to all of them because I'm not a theologian, but to the best of my knowledge, some religions have an ethnic component to them, and other religions do not. Islam in itself is not a religion that has an ethnic component to it, although its center was in Arabia when it started. It intentionally does not have that. It's a migratory school, or schools of thought, migratory schools of thought. But what has happened is the ideas that are imbued within racism and come from the Enlightenment period of people of darker skin coming from non-European countries. So it's a European-centric idea that was Enlightenment, that we separate church from state, that we separate European people from others who are more barbaric. The concept was that people came from other places, didn't know as much. Their intelligence was not as high. Their ability to form civilization, cohesive relationships with each other was not as strong, etc. So, and their morals, again, were also in question. So those ideas are now coming into how we see racism being played out today. And I'm referring to Islamophobia at the moment because people, when they are faced with negative narratives about a particular religious group, have started to show their ideas of what that means. And now the government is taking on the definition that Islamophobia might be a type of racism. I would argue that it has been racialized, Islam has been racialized, but I don't know that it's the same racism as we recognize from people who have a view of white supremacy, for example. So that would definitely be something to discuss, I think, in breakout rooms as to whether you think there are different types of racism. And when we mention racism, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about the racialization of ideas? Or are we talking about colors of skin? Or are we talking about something else completely now that we're moving into a globalized world? So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm coming to the end of my time.
That's correct. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I'll just end there, I think.
Thank you so much, Mahrukh.
Yes, it's a great delight to be able to welcome as our third speaker, Reverend Dr. Inderjit Bogal, OBE. Inderjit is a leading theologian and Methodist minister. He is currently working as an officer in the Discipleship and Ministries Learning Network, Bristol and West Midlands region. He's also founder and president of City of Sanctuary, which promotes a vision of creating places of welcome and safety for people fleeing violence and persecution. And he is a former president of the Methodist Conference and former leader and CEO of the Corrymeela community. Inderjit was awarded an OBE in the New Year's Honours List 2005 for his work in interfaith relations. And he is passionately committed to the achievement of racial justice, interfaith dialogue, and humane migration policies and procedures. Inderjit, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your contribution. Thank you.
In my contribution, I want to highlight the role of theology in human identity. I want to question and reject the idea that white is the color of purity and black is the color of profanity. That white is the ideal color, and black is bleakness, that white is good and black is bad, that white represents law and black represents criminality. It is essential that theology in all faiths and in interfaith dialogue addresses the color-based discrimination, especially in association of blackness or darkness with badness and whiteness with holiness. This contributes to health and healthy and healing relationships. Black Lives Matter includes the challenge that theology cannot remain silent while black and dark-skinned people suffer the denial of their humanity and life. Theology has to address the association of whiteness with purity and blackness with profanity. And what is termed racism is the exercise of prejudice plus power. We all have our prejudices, but the way the world is ordered concentrates power in white and lighter skinned people, and black people live in a world in which blackness is identified with criminality. For me, tackling racism at its worst begins with tackling hatred deeply rooted in concepts of racial differences and in which religious belief is co-opted and used to sanction hatred. So the second thing I want to say is this. I delight in human diversity. Human DNA shows an incredible mixing and intermingling amongst human beings throughout history. Consequently, there is an incredible variety in skin colors and deep visual beauty in them all. The skin color referred to as white is incredibly variable, and so is the skin color of people of Asian and African and Aboriginal people of any nations. We reduce the variables to simplicities of black and white. This remarkable diversity of people rooted in the global South is reduced to BAME, black and minority ethnic. It is like labeling all the immense variety of Indian cuisine as curry, which is as ludicrous as calling all British food gravy. Genetically, all people in the world are about 12th or 13th cousins to each other. This scientific assertion means that there is no basis to the argument that there are different races with one group superior to another. Human beings are not people of different races. We should stop using terms like multiracial and mixed race. Of course, we all carry the capacity for selfishness and have our biases and prejudices, but with our immense differences, we are one race, the human race, and incredibly alike, all made in the image of God. Of significance for our reflections is the fact that, to quote a scholar in genetics, the emergence of scientific approach to human taxonomy coincided with the growth of European empires. Characterization of different populations before the expansion of Europeans around the globe was more likely to be based on religion or language than skin color. But with the birth and the growth of the era of scientific revolution, pigmentation became essential to the character of humans. Skin color came to be used to exercise power and prejudice to other human beings of a different and particularly darker skin tone, and to sanction the subjugation of people. This development was integral to the development of the transatlantic slave trade 400 years ago and the history of racism. It is far easier to sell the case for the occupation and enslavement of people if you are persuaded that the indigenous people are different, have different origins, and are qualitatively inferior to colonists. Scholars in the so-called Enlightenment period of history, the period of empire building and colonial expansion, helped to formulate the idea of fixed differences in human beings, primarily based on skin color, linking skin color to character and of ranking of human beings. Those with lighter skins were said to be superior to those with darker skins. Here lie the roots of the supremacy of the color white. The idea of different races based on skin color was developed. Contemporary science has rejected these classifications, though they persist in many people's mindsets, views, and opinions. So my fourth point is this. Where we are now is that sciences refuse to show linear, discrete categorization of human beings. Rather, it reveals complexity in human history and life, complexity which increases with the movement, meandering, and migrations of people across the globe from about 70,000 years ago. The baseline of the most recent science of human genetics is that all human beings share all of their DNA, and of all the attempts over the centuries to place humans in different races, none succeeds. Genetics refuses to comply with these artificial and superficial categories. So while theology insists that we're all made in the image of God, it is a sacrilege that religion has introduced the idea of clean and dirty, holy and profane into the mix. People who are like us are clean, others are dirty. Whiteness is good and pure, blackness is seen negatively. I reject this reasoning. White has come to be associated with power and privilege and goodness, black with subjugation, denial, and badness. This is why it is important to stand with Black Lives Matter. We all know that white lives matter, but we also have to recognize that Black Lives Matter. Proclaiming that we are members of one race is a rebuke to the nonsense and violence and destruction of racism. Racism is an obscenity, a negation of our humanity. It is a painful form of violence which is dehumanizing and degrading. We all have to stand together, all of us, with all our skin variables, to resist and stop racism. So stop stereotyping people on the basis of skin color and promote good and respectful relationships. Be human and call others to their humanity, and always challenge hatred. And you challenge hatred when you challenge inhumanity. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you, to our wonderful speakers, to all our facilitators, and to all of you for coming along this evening.